I'm joined now, though, by Theo Usherwood. Theo, welcome.
Great to be with you.
Good to see you.
Thank you for inviting me in.
No, my pleasure. Look, let's rattle through some of the poignant stories of the day. One of the things that we haven't talked about yet, of course, is something that Rachel Reeves kind of snuck in yesterday with regard to the civil service, the bloated civil service, I would argue. There's now, I think, 520,000 civil servants in Britain. Total wage bill of the civil service to you, the taxpayer, those watching and listening, this is £19 billion. I'll say that again, 19 billion with a B pounds. That's the wage bill for the civil service in Britain. And I think, look, there is no doubt that it is bloated, it is too big. Obviously it got a lot bigger during the pandemic, didn't shrink since. In fact, I think Labour have added to the tally, actually. But Rachel Reeves yesterday said, look, I'm going to put in place a voluntary redundancy scheme. I think she's calling it an exit scheme. It's basically voluntary redundancy, to save £3.5 billion. Good idea?
Well, you have to beg the question, why can't they do a compulsory scheme? Well, a voluntary scheme, anybody can do it. If you own your listeners, many of them I'm sure own their own businesses, and put in a voluntary scheme tomorrow, just say who would like to come forward. The other question is, and haven't got this detail, they've announced the scheme, how generous is it? Well, I just wonder, I don't think it will be, I would be surprised, how does it compare to what a private business would offer?
I suspect it's very generous, but the very nature of it being voluntary would indicate to me that it is more generous, because there's a statutory amount of money that someone will receive if they're made redundant as a compulsory thing, which I think is something like, and I'm not an expert, but a week's money for every year worked, something like that. The only way you make a compulsory scheme work versus a voluntary scheme is to make the voluntary scheme much more attractive. So I suspect, and again, we're talking about taxpayers' money here, yes, the big headline from Rachel Reeves is I'm going to save £3.5 billion. But yes, what's it going to cost? Because, of course, that cost has to come out all in one go. So Rachel Reeves, I mean, dare I venture, might be massaging the numbers here a bit.
And you don't want a scheme, Russell, where we decide to save the money now, £3.5 billion now, but in 6 months' time, suddenly something happens. I don't know, it's Brexit. We saw civil servants numbers go up with Brexit. Pandemic. Suddenly we need more civil servants, especially working around public health, and suddenly we bring all those people back. Or worse still, we let them go and then we hire them as consultants, which is even more expensive.
That is a fabulous point, because that, I think, is exactly what does happen. In fact, my experience when I was a counsellor was that people would leave by way of a deal, whether it be voluntary redundancy or signing a non-disclosure agreement because something had happened, and they'd walk away with tens of thousands of pounds, and then 4 or 5 weeks later you'd see them in the corridor. You say, hey, X, what are you doing here? I thought you'd left. Oh no, I'm now a consultant, and they've asked me to come back at more money on a day rate to do the job basically that I was doing before. So there's a big danger, I think, that this is manipulated, that it is just a headline, that it is sleight of hand. So I don't want to be too down on the fact that at first blush it looks like Rachel Reeves is trying to cut the size and the cost of the civil service to save that money. I want to see the detail of the numbers though. Where is that saving of £3.5 billion? Over what period of time? Is that 5 years, 10 years, 50 years?
So I think it's over the course of the forecast, which is till 29-30. So that was how
the end of the
Parliament. The other thing to remember, and I read the detail in the story actually, and it was that each application for voluntary redundancy is going to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. And the danger you have here, actually, Russell, is you end up with a perverse system where actually the best people can actually be hired by the private sector. So the people who really know what they're doing in a particular department, who have the best contacts, who actually know their way around how government works. What happens is they suddenly go off to the private sector and they secure themselves another job. Then they do the voluntary redundancy, and they say, okay, I'll take the voluntary redundancy. They get double bubble effectively. They leave the civil service. They go into the private sector. And now the government's saying, well, actually, we want to have the right to block any individual leaving. But actually, what you don't do is what needs to happen is we need to get rid of the dead wood. We need to get rid of the individuals who aren't contributing to the civil service, who aren't making it better, but are actually taking.
And is it fair to say, and I think I speak on behalf of anybody watching this or listening to this that has ever had any interaction with a local council about their council tax or their bins being collected, or anyone that's tried to speak to the passport office or DVLA about a missing driving licence or whatever, generally, and of course this won't apply to every single public sector employee, but generally the response is pretty apathetic, pretty inefficient, and not very good. So is it too much of a stretch to imagine that those 520,000 civil servants, the same job, if they all worked a bit harder, could be done by, what, 400,000 civil servants? I think that's not an outrageous kind of summary of where we could get to, and saving the salaries of 120,000 civil servants would be, by way of a compulsory redundancy, significant and permanent.
Yes, and I think it was Margaret Thatcher who made that, Baroness Thatcher, the former Prime Minister,
God rest her soul.
Who made the comment, what could we do? Could we do exactly the same with, if my memory serves, thousands of civil servants?
Theo, it would happen in the private sector. So, the world, the economy, Britain, we all go through, economic cycles. Sometimes those cycles in terms of downturns are enforced by our hapless politicians, like it's happening now. But in a private sector environment, of which I've been involved, I'm afraid sometimes people have to be laid off. It just happens. It seems though that in this instance, Rachel Reeves probably knows that the civil service is bloated. But of course, because there's a union element, and because of course she's just been seen, I mean, I don't know if you've seen the front page, you've got the front page of the Sun there, but the front page of the Mirror has gone to war with Rachel Reeves today, a left-leaning tabloid, having a pop at a Labour Chancellor because of what she's done on benefits. So maybe Rachel Reeves just doesn't have the courage to say, and do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to cut the civil service by 25%. No,
and I think the figure that she's talked about is 15%, but certainly within that, and Pat McFadden said it a couple of weeks ago, who's the Deputy Prime Minister, that's in all but name, turned around and said there aren't going to be any compulsory redundancies. They're very wary of people like Dave Penman, who runs the Civil Service Union. They can't afford to annoy him, and of course what they don't want to happen is they don't want the civil service to go on go slow mode. And that was something the Tories, for what they tried to do in terms of civil service reform. You think back to Jacob Rees-Mogg putting those notes on civil servants' desks saying, why aren't you at work today? The net result of that was that actually you ended up with a civil service that just didn't want to do business with ministers. And that actually ended up being counterproductive.
Well, they didn't want to do as they were told.
No.
Which is, and the clue is the clue is in the second word of their title, civil servants. Yeah,
they're there to serve the people, but they're not going to. They don't. Civil servants, and I think the best. Do you ever watch Yes, Prime Minister?
What,
yes, Minister. Yes, Minister. Yes, Minister. But that's how they operate.
A parody that's now being played out for real.
But it's been played out for real for generations. Yeah. They're a law unto themselves. Many of these individuals, right? Yeah. They will do what they want to do.
And when do we ever hear about a civil servant being sacked for lack of performance or gross misconduct? Apart from Sue Gray, who's speaking in the House of Lords today, by the way. Guess what she's speaking about, Theo? Unfair dismissal. The irony. The irony of that. How funny is that? So look, we've got to stop treating the civil service as almost putting it on a pedestal, treating it with kid gloves. But also, civil servants don't have that right to that job. If there's any civil servants watching this, listening, if I'm being really unfair here, being down on civil servants based on my fairly considerable experience both in the public sector and as a consumer, please, look, defend your position, sing for your supper. Tell me why civil servants are the hardest working people in Britain, and we need more and more and more of them. 0344 499 1000, because frankly, I don't think I'll ever be convinced that that's true.
But I remember the late Jeremy Hayward, who was of course the Cabinet Secretary for multiple Prime Ministers, made the point that he was in front of a select committee and he made the point that, we provide a service to ministers and that it's not the same. They don't view, which was quite telling in his remarks, he never viewed, and he was the ultimate civil service. He knew his way, he knew how to handle the most capricious ministers in their view, the civil service's view. But they don't see themselves as employees of ministers. They see themselves as slightly detached, and that creates a problem. Now, when you make a decision, you say you run a business, when you make a decision, in the back of your mind, you're thinking about pounds and pennies, because that's your money. When they make a decision,
there's accountability.
They don't need to think about the pounds and the pennies because it's not their money. Yeah. And that's where we end up with this problem, where you end up with, okay, we've got the pandemic, let's just hire more people. Okay, we've got Brexit, let's just create a whole new department. Yeah. Because actually, they don't need to worry about the bottom line. Yeah. They don't need to worry about the profits.
Yeah. Well, my experience is even more sinister than that, which is that civil servants think they run the country, and sometimes weak politicians allow them to do so. I remember a chief executive of a certain council saying to me many years ago, if politicians leave a void, civil servants will fill it.
Yeah.
And that's really scary, because civil servants are not elected, they're not accountable, they should be, they're not, but they also have, shock horror, their own agendas. Yeah. A bit like we were talking about the Sentencing Council just now. That Sentencing Council decision to recommend to government that we dumb down immigration offences, that is born of an agenda. I mean, tell me what you think about the sentencing guidelines that we were talking about today.
I mean, look, we've got to end up in a situation, and you can't turn around and say, or the ministers or Prime Minister or whoever cannot turn around and say you don't have a two-tier justice system when the sentencing guidelines proving that there is a
now shout very loudly that that's the case. I've just got to bring some breaking news, Theo. Just bear with me a second. So, Prime Minister Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron have agreed today to send officials to Ukraine to help put in place plans for after a peace deal is agreed. It comes after Moscow warned the UK and France that they are risking a direct clash between Russia and NATO. Serious stuff. Speaking in Paris after another meeting of the Coalition of the Willing, Starmer today accused Vladimir Putin of playing games over the peace process, saying there had been absolute clarity that Russia is trying to delay among those present. So to be very, very clear, Keir Starmer, in his quest to be seen as a world statesman and to end up with some kind of Blair-like legacy, not that I think you'd want a Blair-like legacy, Theo, is shouting the odds with his miniature friend, President Emmanuel Macron of France, whereby they are effectively forging a plan, the precursor being sending officials to the Ukraine, but shortly thereafter, one would imagine, boots on the ground as a peacekeeping force in direct defiance of warnings from Russia. You got any comment on that?
There's another line as well to come out of that short press conference, and I saw it. He faced the cameras. Keir Starmer just now with Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, and Keir Starmer also made the comment, Russell, that he thought, in his view, sanctions should not be removed, and that is a key demand from Moscow in its negotiations with Washington, that sanctions are removed in order to get that ceasefire.
So under what circumstances does Starmer think that the sanctions should be removed? Because otherwise, what's the incentive? I mean, what's the added incentive for Russia to agree to a ceasefire?
You can only go back to the previous argument that Keir Starmer has made, which is the wholesale withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine before sanctions are removed.
He's obviously not researched Vladimir Putin very well, is he?
No, I mean,
he's not a man that's going to be pushed around and being told what to do, is he?
Look, ultimately, this is a negotiation. It doesn't matter, and it's not something I say with any pleasure or any, pleasure. It's a regrettable situation, but this is a negotiation that is being conducted between Washington and Moscow, between Trump and Putin.
Well, let me give you my take.
Anything that happens anywhere
Let me give you my
else.
take. This, unfortunately, is a negotiation between egos. It is the egos of Donald Trump, Keir Starmer, Vladimir Putin, and Zelensky. That is a very, very unfortunate and rather dangerous combination because no one wants to back down, particularly as they are on the world stage. So that makes this very volatile indeed. My personal view is that if we continue as we are, no one is going to give way because no one has a face-saving mechanism by which to back out of the door. So will some of the Ukraine have to be annexed? Yes. Should we stop giving all this money to Zelensky? In my humble opinion, yes. Otherwise, nothing changes. And this war goes on for years and years and years.
But I think ultimately what's going to happen is Trump, if he can get Putin to the negotiating table, Trump has all the cards, and he's just going to exert incredible pressure.
Off tangent here, but Trump, for all of his faults, he is the new kid on the block in terms of him being the catalyst that allows the likes of Zelensky and Putin to back out through that door with some grace. That is what needs to happen here. If we keep doing the same thing, expecting different outcomes, guess what? There ain't going to be a different outcome.
I think that's the definition of insanity, isn't it?
Let's go back to the migrant question as well, because there's a report here in the Telegraph about how the OBR, so Rachel Reeves' favourite organisation, is actually saying that Labour, in effect, in the long term, it's official, overseeing a long-term surge in migrants to Britain. So even though they are trying to say they think net migration will drop, I think it was about 900,000 people last year. They think that will drop to about 340,000 a year by the end of the decade. It is still far, far higher than it previously has been. So basically, Labour are not solving the migration problem either illegally or legally at all, and that's official. That's from the government's own body, the OBR.
And you had Philip Hammond, the former Chancellor, Conservative Chancellor.
We just talked about that,
on the radio this morning, saying that if you want to build the homes that Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer want to build, the only way you can do that is to import migration from abroad. Now, the argument might be that you get an increase in GDP, but you don't get an increase, and this is what previous figures show, an increase in GDP per capita.
Yeah, we're getting poorer per person. And so the birth death rate in the UK is about at parity now. So as many people die as are born. So we're not a growing population. The problem with that is that some on the left believe that migration, almost as an open door policy, that we should just let all and sundry in, solves that. But of course, if a lot of the migration coming to the UK doesn't contribute to the economy because people are on benefits.
Or not net contribution to the economy.
Yes, yeah. Then of course the economy doesn't grow, or if it does, overall, per person, we're getting poorer and poorer. I was absolutely astonished this morning to hear Philip Hammond saying that as a former Conservative Chancellor. I would suggest that whoever it was within the selection committee of his constituency when he was selected as a Conservative MP didn't do a very good job, because if you genuinely believe what Philip Hammond believes, you have no place in the Conservative Party whatsoever.
It's why Reform's doing so well. It's why cannibalised the Conservative Party at the last election.
How on earth is the Conservative Party? I've got no idea if you're a Conservative-minded voter or not.
I remain impartial.
Great, good.
I just say
so how does the Conservative Party go from Thatcher to Philip Hammond? And how on earth has that happened over the last few years? We go from protecting our borders, wanting to see low tax, pro-business, being very, very pragmatic about immigration, being tough on crime. We, under the last 14 years of a Conservative government, and whether that's Cameron, May, Boris or Sunak, we've ended up running the country like Liberal Democrats.
So, or you ended up certainly with Cameron. I think what happened is you had... we live in a much more connected world than we lived with Margaret Thatcher, which means that people can travel much more easily, and they can. And we end up in a situation where, and this is, after where we haven't invested in training up and educating and providing the right vocational training to the young people in our schools and education in this country. And so in order to fill those skills gaps, rather than actually going in and saying we want to get kids out of our schools into the workforce with the right attitude, with the right skill set that employers want, we can't do that anymore. And so what do we have to do? We have to go abroad in order to get those skills. I did an interview with Janine Chamberlain, who runs LinkedIn, back at the end of October, and she made the point to me, for all of the government's talk about net zero, we just don't have, let's just say, for one moment, and I know how you feel about net zero, and I've got a similar skepticism about it, but we don't have in this country, the point she's making at the moment, and they know this from their algorithms on the LinkedIn app, right? This is not a political point. We don't have the people, the men and women who can insulate the homes.